My brother got married, my father leaned into the microphone and said, "We are so proud of our son. He is everything we ever hoped for." He paused. The whole room was smiling. Benny looked at my mother, and they both laughed the way people laugh when they're sharing an inside joke, and he said, "Honestly, we got lucky. 1 out of 2 isn't bad." The room laughed too. I was sitting at table 7. Not at the family table. Table 7, near the back, next to my brother's college roommate and his girlfriend, who spent the entire dinner talking to each other about a trip to Portugal they were planning. I had on a blue dress I bought specifically for this wedding. I'd driven 6 hours from Louisville to be there. I sat very still and waited for my father to finish his speech. He never looked at me. I want to be honest about something before I keep going. What I just described, that moment, it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me. It wasn't even the worst thing my parents ever said. It was just the first time they said it with a microphone, the first time there were 200 witnesses, the first time I couldn't pretend I'd misheard, or misread the situation, or taken something out of context. That's the thing about growing up the way I did. You spend so much time convincing yourself you're imagining it. My brother's name is Nathan. He's 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what favoritism meant, he was the one who had it. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. Or at least I'm trying not to. I say it because it's true, and because pretending it wasn't true for most of my life is part of why it took me so long to get out. Nathan was the athlete. Nathan was the one who got a car for his 16th birthday. Nathan was the one my parents called first when anything happened, good or bad, because he was the one whose opinion actually mattered to them. I was never cruel to him about any of this. It wasn't his fault. He was a good person who happened to be born first into a family where birth order meant everything, and he got the version of our parents that still had something left to give. I got the version that was tired. My parents, I'll call them what they were because I'm done softening it, were not bad people in the way that gets you on the news. They weren't violent. They didn't drink. They went to church. They paid their bills. But there is a particular kind of emotional neglect that doesn't leave marks anyone can see, and that's the kind I grew up with. The kind where you're present in the house but absent from the family, where your report card gets a glance and your brother's gets a frame. Where you learn, slowly, and then all at once, that you are loved the way people love a piece of furniture, acknowledged when necessary, otherwise ignored. I was 26 years old and working as a registered nurse in Louisville when Nathan got married. I had my own apartment, my own car, my own life. I had built it carefully, the way you build something when no one is watching or helping, one brick at a time. I had a few close friends, a dog named Theo, a savings account I was actually proud of. I was not, by any reasonable measure, a person who needed rescuing. But I still went to that wedding. I still drove 6 hours. I still bought the blue dress. I think I kept hoping, even then, that something would shift, that my parents would see the life I had made and feel something they hadn't felt before. Pride, maybe. Or just recognition. The sense that I was real to them in a way that mattered. The speech killed that hope, not in a dramatic way, more like the way a flame goes out when you finally stop feeding it. After dinner, I found my mother near the dessert table. I told her calmly, I want to be clear that I was calm, that the speech had hurt me, that the joke had landed wrong, that it would have meant a lot if they had mentioned me. She looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, Lily," she said. "My name is Lily. You're too sensitive. Your father was just being funny. Nobody took it seriously." "I took it seriously," I said. She patted my arm. "You always do." And that was the end of the conversation. Because Nathan and his new wife were cutting the cake, and my mother turned away to watch. And I was standing there alone by the dessert table in my blue dress with a piece of something breaking off inside me that I had been trying to hold together for 26 years. I left before the dancing started. I didn't say goodbye. I drove back to Louisville in the dark, and somewhere on I-65, I started crying. And I cried for about 40 miles, and then I stopped, because I made a decision. I was done. Not just with the wedding. Not just with the night. I was done with the whole thing, with showing up and being invisible, with making myself smaller so they wouldn't have to acknowledge how little space they'd given me. with waiting for an apology that was never going to come because they didn't believe they owed me one. I went home, sat on my couch with Theo in my lap, and I thought very carefully about what I wanted my life to look like. Not what I'd been handed. Not what I'd been told I deserved. What I actually wanted. Then, I blocked my parents on my phone. I blocked them on email. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't send a letter. I just stopped being available. And I waited to see if anyone would notice. My cousin Addie noticed. She called me about 3 weeks later, not because my parents had said anything, but because she tried to tag me in a photo from the wedding and realized I'd gone quiet. Addie is the one person in my extended family I trust completely. She's 5 years older than me, lives in Nashville, and she's the kind of person who says exactly what she means without using it as a weapon. She listened to the whole story and then she said, "I'm not surprised. I've been watching this your whole life." That meant more to me than I can explain. The months after were strange. Easier than I expected in some ways, harder in others. I had built my day-to-day life almost entirely independent of my parents already, so the practical silence wasn't disruptive. I still went to work. I still had Theo. I still called Addie on Sunday nights. What was hard was the grief. And I want to name it as grief, because that's what it was. Not anger, not relief, though there was some of both. Mostly grief, for the family I had wanted and never had. For the version of my parents that might have existed if things had been different. For the child I had been, who kept trying, for so long, to be enough. I worked a lot that first year. Night shifts, weekend shifts, whatever was available. I was a pediatric nurse, which probably sounds ironic given the circumstances, but I loved my work with a kind of fierceness that I think came directly from what I'd lacked. I knew what it felt like when a child wasn't seen. I made sure every kid in my care felt seen. Year 2, I started therapy. I'm mentioning this not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered, and because I think people skip over this part in these stories and I don't want to. My therapist, an older woman with an office in the Highlands neighborhood and a small fountain that ran all through our sessions, helped me understand something I had been circling for years without ever landing on it. That I had spent my whole life working to earn love that had already been decided against me. That it wasn't a performance problem, that no amount of achievement or accommodation was going to change the fundamental dynamic, because the dynamic wasn't about me. It was about them, and what they were capable of, and the limits of that. She said something once that I've thought about many times since. She said, "You've been auditing yourself for 30 years looking for the deficiency. What if the audit was always looking in the wrong place?" I wrote that down. I still have it. Year 3, I got promoted to charge nurse. I adopted a second dog, a ridiculous basset hound named George, who immediately took over the couch. I started running because someone at work dared me to sign up for a 5K, and I didn't want to back down. And then I liked it more than I expected. My life was good. Actually good. The kind of good that isn't about the absence of pain, but about the presence of something you've built. I hadn't talked to my parents in almost 5 years when Nathan called. He used my work number. I didn't recognize it at first. I almost didn't pick up. And when I heard his voice, I felt something go cold and careful inside me. We hadn't spoken since the wedding, not because I'd blocked him, but because he'd never called. I used to wonder about that, whether he knew, whether he'd asked our parents about me. Whether he'd watched me leave that reception and felt anything at all. He said, "Lily." "It's Nathan." I said, "I know." He said our mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's, that she was still functional, still at home, but that things were going to get harder, and that our father wasn't in great health either, high blood pressure, some cardiac concerns, and that he couldn't manage everything alone. He'd talked to some care coordinators, he said. He'd looked into options, but he kept coming back to the fact that I was a nurse and that it would mean a lot to him and to our parents if I would consider coming back. There was a silence after he finished. I sat at my desk and I looked out the window at the parking garage across the street, and I thought about the speech. I thought about the dessert table and my mother's hand on my arm. I thought about driving 40 miles on I-65 in the dark, crying until I didn't have anything left. I thought about the 5 years I had spent building a life, slowly and carefully, in a city where no one's first assumption about me was that I was the one who didn't count. Then I said, I need some time to think about it. Nathan said he understood. I called Addie that night. She listened the whole way through, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, whatever you decide, and I mean whatever, I'm going to support you. But I need to ask you something first. Are you considering going back because you want to, or because you feel like you're supposed to want to? That question took me about 2 weeks to answer. I want to be honest about what I was feeling during those 2 weeks, because this is the part of the story that I think people get wrong when they hear it from the outside. People hear, she thought about going back to help, and they assume weakness. They assume she never really healed. They assume she's about to repeat the same cycle and get hurt the same way again. But here's what was actually happening inside me. I wasn't considering going back out of hope anymore. The hope that they would finally see me, finally acknowledge what they'd done, that was gone. The speech had killed it, and the years since had composted whatever remained. What I was sitting with was something different, something more complicated. I was thinking about the person I had become and what she was capable of, and whether I could walk into that house, not as the child who needed something from them, but as the adult who had stopped needing it. I also thought about my mother, not the woman who'd patted my arm at the dessert table. The much earlier version, I don't know how old I was, maybe 7, who used to sit with me on the back porch on summer evenings and read to me from whatever library book she had going. She wasn't warm the way I needed her to be, but she was there, sometimes in small ways, and those small ways were real even if they weren't enough. I couldn't make those two things fit neatly together. I stopped trying to. I called Nathan back after 2 weeks and I told him I would come, not to move back, not to take over, but to do an assessment. One visit. I'd evaluate what kind of care they actually needed, what resources were available in their area, what a realistic care plan would look like. I would do it as a professional courtesy because I was a nurse, and that was my skill set, and because despite everything they were still my parents. But I was doing it on my terms. I would stay with Addie, not with them. I would not pretend the past hadn't happened, and if at any point the visit became something I couldn't handle, I would leave. Nathan said, that's more than fair. I drove back to my hometown on a Thursday in October. The trees were changing. I had Theo in the back seat. George was too chaotic for a trip like this. And Addie met me at her apartment with takeout from a Thai place she knew I liked and didn't ask me a single question that night, just let me sit and breathe. I went to my parents' house the next morning. My father answered the door. He looked smaller than I remembered. That's the thing no one warns you about when you haven't seen someone in 5 years. The way time has worked on them. He was still my father. Same eyes, same way of holding his shoulders slightly too rigid, but he was 71 now and he looked it. He looked at me for a moment in a way I couldn't read, and then he stepped back and let me in. My mother was in the living room in a chair by the window. The Parkinson's was early stage, like Nathan had said. She could walk, she could speak, her tremor was mild, but it had changed the quality of her stillness. She looked up when I came in and I saw something cross her face that I didn't expect. She looked relieved. Not happy exactly, not apologetic, just relieved, like someone who had been holding their breath for a long time. Lily, she said. Hi, Mom, I said. We didn't hug, we weren't that family. But I sat down across from her and I asked her, in the calmest, most professional voice I had, how she had been feeling, what the tremor was like in the mornings, whether she'd noticed any changes in her sleep. She answered carefully, like she was being evaluated, which she was, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation she said, quietly, almost to herself more than to me, I didn't think you'd come. I said, I almost didn't. She nodded. She looked out the window. She said, I know we weren't always fair to you. I waited. She said, I don't know how to fix that. I'm not sure I know how to talk about it. She paused. But I know it was real. It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that. It was not the apology I'd spent years imagining, the one where they finally understood the full weight of what they'd done and said so in language that matched the size of it. This was smaller than that. Quieter. Less certain. But it was also the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me, and I had been a nurse for long enough to know that sometimes honest and small is what people have available at the end of their lives. And you can take it or leave it. I took it. Not because it was enough, but because I'd stopped needing it to be enough. I had built a life that didn't have a hole in it, the shape of her apology. Whatever she gave or didn't give, I was whole without it. I spent 3 days doing the assessment. I sat with my parents, reviewed their medications, spoke with their primary care physician, researched in-home care options, and looked into whether they were candidates for an assisted living transition in the next couple of years. I put together a 12-page document for Nathan with every recommendation laid out clearly, with contacts, cost estimates, and a suggested timeline. I did it the way I would have done it for any family navigating a complicated medical situation. Before I left, my father found me in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway the way he always did, not quite entering the room, and he said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Sure." He said, "I know it wasn't easy." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the microphone. I thought about the 200 witnesses. I thought about I-65 in the dark. I said, "No, it wasn't." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. I drove back to Louisville on a Sunday. Theo slept the whole way. The trees on either side of the interstate were full orange and red, the kind of October color that feels almost unreal, like something a painter would get criticized for because no one would believe it. I had the windows down a little even though it was cold. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which is a thing I have learned to appreciate, the ability to sit inside your own head without it becoming a war zone. About an hour outside of Louisville, I called Addie. She picked up on the second ring. I told her how it had gone. She listened. When I finished, she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. "Like, I went back to a place that used to have power over me," I said, "and it didn't anymore." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That sounds like what winning actually looks like." I've thought about that a lot since. What winning actually looks like. It doesn't look the way I thought it would when I was younger. It doesn't look like a confrontation where you finally say the right thing and they finally understand. It doesn't look like them admitting, in full, every harm they caused. It doesn't look like the family you wanted materializing from the one you got. It looks like driving home on a Sunday in October with your dog asleep in the back seat and the windows down and the trees going orange on both sides of the road, and knowing, not performing knowing, actually knowing, that you are okay. That you built a life, that you did it yourself, that whatever they said into that microphone 6 years ago, it was never true. I am not useless. I never was. I am a nurse who has held the hands of children in the worst moments of their lives and stayed steady for them. I am a person who built something real from nothing they gave me. I am someone whose dog trusts her completely, which sounds small but is not small at all when you think about what trust actually requires. I don't talk to my parents regularly. The visit didn't become a reconciliation. I am not in the story I used to tell myself, where eventually they come around and we become the family I always wanted. I'm in a different story now, a quieter one. One I chose. I check in with Nathan occasionally. He's handling the care coordination now, with the help of an in-home aide who comes 3 mornings a week, one of the contacts I recommended. My mother's Parkinson's is progressing slowly. My father's blood pressure is under control. They are being looked after, and I am, for the first time in my life, not waiting for anything from them. That's not an ending that ties up neatly, I know that. But it's the true one, and I'd rather give you the true one than wrap something in a bow just to make it feel finished. Some families are the kind that hold you, and some families are the kind that teach you, through a long and painful education, how to hold yourself. I got the second kind. I'm still glad I learned. I've been asked a few times, since telling this story to people close to me, whether I think what happened was fair, whether my parents got what they deserved, or whether I got what I deserved, or whether the whole thing balanced out the way it was supposed to. I don't really think in those terms anymore, not because fairness doesn't matter, but because I've learned that waiting for the world to settle a debt on your behalf is one of the slowest ways to waste a life. Here's what I actually believe. Having lived through it, the way you treat people over a long period of time shapes the kind of person you become and the kind of relationships you get to keep. My parents made a choice, over and over again, across decades, to treat one of their children as an afterthought. That choice didn't just affect me. It hollowed something out in them too. By the time my mother was sitting in that chair by the window, looking relieved that I'd even walked through the door, she wasn't just dealing with a diagnosis. She was dealing with the accumulated weight of every moment she had chosen not to show up for me. You can't spend 30 years making someone feel invisible and then be surprised when they disappear. That's not karma in any mystical sense, it's just consequence. Actions have weight, they accumulate, and eventually you have to carry what you've built. What I'm more interested in, honestly, is what I chose to do with the hand I was dealt, because I could have stayed angry. I had every right to. I could have let the speech at that wedding become the central fact of my identity. The girl whose father grabbed a microphone and told 200 people she didn't count. I could have let that define the ceiling of what I thought I was allowed to want or become. Instead, I became a nurse. I learned how to hold space for people in their worst moments and stay steady when everything around them was falling apart. I built a savings account, a home, a life with 2 ridiculous dogs and a cousin who answers on the second ring, and a therapist who taught me that I had been auditing the wrong thing for 30 years. None of that came from my parents. All of it came from deciding, over and over again, that I was worth investing in even when no one else was investing in me. That's the thing about being raised, to feel like you don't matter. You have 2 options. You can internalize it, or you can spend your life proving it wrong. Not to them, but to yourself. Proving it wrong to yourself is the only version that actually works. I think about Addie's question a lot, whether I was going back because I wanted to, or because I felt like I was supposed to want to. It was the most honest question anyone has ever asked me, and it forced me to get clear about something I've been blurry on my whole life: the difference between obligation and choice. I had spent 30 years doing things out of obligation, trying to earn love, trying to be enough, trying to fit into a family that had already decided where I stood. Going back on my own terms as the person I had actually become was the first time I made a choice that was entirely mine. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that estrangement is always the answer, or that reconciliation is always weakness, or that families are simple enough to sort into clean categories. What I'd want you to take is this: you are not who they said you were. You never were. And the life you build from that knowledge, quietly, carefully, on your own terms, is the only answer that matters.